Today we're going to be continuing our study of narrative writing. In fact, we're going to be talking about entertaining beginnings. So when you think about the times that you've been in a library or in a bookstore and you pick up a book, what is it that grabs your attention and hooks you from the start? You probably picked up the book because you liked the outside of it, the cover art. Maybe it's in a genre that you enjoy on a regular basis. But if you open your favorite book to the first page, the first line, chances are that story beginning is what has captured your interest and intrigued you to read on. Because let's face it, if we're bored at the beginning, we're probably not very faithful that things are gonna get better. So successful beginnings must grab the reader's attention and get the story off and rolling quickly. It's also not very fun to read a book or to read an essay or to read a story where it takes pages and pages and pages for something to happen. The beginning is where the writer introduces the main character, the setting, and the purpose for the story. It's small, but it's super important to a narrative. That entertaining beginning sets the stage for everything. So check out these beginnings. This is a story about my gymnastics tournament. It was a cold day outside. My name is Julia Rosen, and I'm writing about an important day that I've looked forward to. I got up and got dressed. I had some breakfast. When you look at these openings, what do you think? They're pretty boring. And in fact, some of these I see a lot, and it sounds really mean, but this is a story about my gymnastics tournament. When you start off with this is a story about, it automatically kind of puts me to sleep. Or when you introduce yourself, this sounds really harsh, and I'm going to hate to say it, but your reader doesn't care what your name is, and they want you just to start the story. They don't need you to warn them what your story is going to be about. I got up, got dressed, I had some breakfast. How is that any different from what your reader did that day? Or it was a cold day outside. Okay, why is that important? So instead, authors generate entertaining beginnings by asking productive questions. This word productive, it means to produce. Productive questions produce a thought. They produce answers. So here are some, when we look at authors, famous authors, not famous authors, but just authors who are good at what they do, here are some of the ways that they begin. We call that author's craft. We want to look at authors and how they complete their craft. When we look at their beginnings, there are a few major ways that they start. They could start with an action where you might ask, what would you do in that situation? Or what are you doing in that situation? They could start with a dialogue or exclamation, like, what might you say? They could start with a thought or a question. What would you wonder or worry? Now I'm going to say this about questions. It has to be a productive question that gets you more than just a one-word answer. If you ask, have you ever had an obstacle that you had to overcome? Everyone's going to say yes. So a more productive question might be, what would you do if? Okay? Or if this had changed, what would happen? You can also start with a sound. Ask, what might you hear? Answers to productive questions help create those entertaining beginnings. So let's take a look. Let's revise this beginning using each technique. This is the beginning that we're going to choose right here. This is a story about my gymnastics tournament. When we think about a gymnastics tournament, and if you don't have any experience with gymnastics, that's okay. It could be a soccer tournament. It could be a basketball tournament. It could be a baseball tournament. It could be a chess tournament. It could be anything. So don't freak out if you're like, I don't know anything about gymnastics. But I want to show you how we can revise it and make it better instead of just, this is a story about. Get to the story. So this was our before. This is going to be our after. I stared at the uneven bars, took a deep breath, and bounded forward. This is an action. I'm staring. I'm taking a deep breath. I'm bounding. There are 3 good, vivid verbs right there in the first sentence. Notice how it's happening before she actually does anything on the uneven bars. This is her build-up. That's why we would use it as a beginning. What about a different technique? Same story opening. This is a story about my gymnastics tournament. It's kind of boring. But if I use some dialogue or an exclamation, I might ask myself, well, what would I say? Stay calm, I whispered as I stepped toward the balance beam. We know that as athletes, sometimes we sort of talk to ourselves when we're nervous and we talk through things. It doesn't have to be the character saying anything to anyone else. But just from this, stay calm, I whispered as I stepped toward the balance beam, we might notice that the narrator is nervous because she's having to tell herself to stay calm. So maybe this is a big deal. There's a lot of pressure on her at the gymnastics tournament. We hear all about this. We also know from this that she's at something gymnastics because there's a balance beam involved. Let's try even another technique. This is a story about my gymnastics tournament. That's the before. I might ask myself a thought or a question. What would I wonder or worry? How could I possibly complete my floor routine with my sore ankle? So again, a productive question makes the reader think like, well, how could you do that? How is a very, very powerful question word. This is a story about my gymnastics tournament. How do we know that we're talking about gymnastics in this new box? You're right. The words floor routine tell us that this is a gymnastics themed essay or story. And then let's try one more. A story about my gymnastics tournament, same boring beginning, but now let's include a sound. Like, what might you hear at a gymnastics tournament? Well, the crowd cheered as I approached the parallel bars. So here's my sound, the crowd cheered. And then parallel bars is what is giving the reader a clue. Hey, this is going to be about gymnastics. So let's look at these beginnings. The night whispered of distant thunder. It was muggy, hot, a miserable night for sleeping. Twice I had awakened hoping it was time to get up, but each time the night had been total blackness with no hint of a graying dawn. Is this an action? Is it dialogue? Is it thought? Is it a question, a sound, some combination? So I hear the thunder. I feel the muggy, hot feeling. I awakened. That's an action. But each time the night had been a total blackness with no hint of a graying dawn. So it gives us some action. It gives us some sound. It sort of gives us a description. That's from Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, which is an excellent book. Off there to the right, somewhere, is a large island, said Whitney. It's rather a mystery. What island is it? Rainsford asked. The old charts call it Ship Trap Island, Whitney replied. A suggestive name, isn't it? Sailors have a curious dread of the place. I don't know why. Some superstition. So if you look at this one, obviously you can see these quotation marks. Words like asked, replied, tell us that this is dialogue between two characters, Whitney and Rainsford. And I love this idea of Ship Trap Island. Man, when you start, if this is the first 4 sentences of your story, I'm going to keep reading because obviously there's going to be some sort of either a capture of a ship or a wreck of a ship if they're getting close to Ship Trap Island. That's a really powerful name. They stood silent in the dim-lit darkness. Somewhere out beyond the rock, thunder still rumbled and growled. So we've got some sound here. The thunder rumbled and growled. But even those words, rumbled and growled, to give us some action. I'm riding my bicycle and I'm on Route 31 in Monument, Massachusetts, on my way to Rutterburg, Vermont, and I'm pedaling furiously because this is an old-fashioned bike. No speeds, no fenders. Only the warped tires and the brakes that don't always work, and the handlebars with cracked rubber grips to steer with. At home, I didn't wave goodbye to anybody. I just left, without fanfare. I didn't go to school. I didn't call anyone. So we've got a ton of action in here. We also have some great description. because this is not a bike. If you're trying to make a getaway, this is not a bike to do it on. So it sort of sets us up to know that this kid is maybe not going to make it very far, because he's pedaling furiously, but this is a beat up bike, and it's probably not going to work out well for him. And the suspense that's already building up. At home, I didn't wave goodbye to anyone. I just left without fanfare. I didn't go to school. I didn't call anyone. The shortness of those sentences makes it feel very urgent. Elizabetta, where are you going? Oh, and I was so close to the door. Ah, well. I descend from tiptoe and walk from the corridor into the kitchen. There's some dialogue. There's also some action. I descend from tiptoe and walk from the corridor. So obviously this was someone who was trying to sneak out because they're walking on tiptoe. And then once they're caught, they just walk normally. He wields a pickaxe in his short, thick arms, stares at me through narrowed eyes. His mouth curls. Who are you? And what are you doing here? This is a description. We get some dialogue, but we also get some description that sounds a little bit menacing, right? Anyone who's got a pickaxe, which is like an axe that also has a sharp pick on it, kind of sounds a little bit dangerous, a little bit scary. The sound of the tornado ripping Granddaddy Opal's house from its foundation and hurling the splintered pieces across the street left us deaf and stunned. So we've got that sound and that vivid verb, that action verb, the tornado ripping it from its foundation and hurling the splintered pieces. This is something that's very damaging. And you can kind of start to think, like, if that were me, if that were my house or my granddaddy's house, how would I feel? So let's review. Beginnings need to be entertaining. Authors, in order to do this, need to ask productive questions to write entertaining beginnings. So questions like, what would you do? What would you say? What would you wonder or worry? What would you hear? If you were the person in the story, if you were the character in the story, and you were facing this moment, what would you do? What would you say? What would you wonder or worry? What would you hear? You can use action, exclamation, thoughts, and questions or sound, description, powerful, powerful moments that hook the reader and make them want to keep reading. So use these to get your readers reading. Actions, exclamations, thoughts or questions, and sounds. As you begin using these, remember, you might test out a few before you make your final decision on the one that you like best. Happy writing!